It begins in a way that almost feels like nothing is happening, yet everything is changing at the same time. You wake up and the world still looks the same, but your mind no longer interacts with it in the same way. The things that once pulled your attention so easily now feel distant, almost silent. Your goals are still there, your responsibilities are still there, but something inside you has started to detach from the emotional meaning you used to attach to everything. And that is where the confusion quietly begins to form, not as chaos on the outside, but as a shift on the inside that you cannot fully explain yet. And what makes it even more unsettling is that you cannot tell whether you are losing yourself or finally seeing yourself for the first time. There is a stage in deep personal transformation where awareness expands faster than understanding, and this imbalance creates a strange internal experience that feels like being suspended between two versions of your life. The old version of you still exists in memory, still active in habits, still visible in routine, but it no longer feels like the center of who you are. And the new version has not fully arrived yet. It is only forming in fragments, in thoughts you do not fully trust, in emotions you cannot fully name, in silence that feels heavier than usual. And so you start questioning everything, not realizing that the questioning itself is the beginning of something far more significant than clarity. And what that leads to is something most people never recognize while they are in it. Because what feels like being lost is actually the mind entering a restructuring phase where identity, perception, and emotional conditioning are being rewritten at a deeper level. But this process does not announce itself clearly. It does not feel organized or comforting. It feels like distance from everything familiar, including yourself. And the more you try to grab onto what used to feel stable, the more it seems to slip away in subtle ways, as if life itself is asking you to stop holding on so tightly. But the reason behind that request is not revealed immediately, and that is where the real transformation quietly begins to unfold. There comes a moment in this internal shift where your usual way of thinking starts to feel slightly delayed, as if your thoughts are arriving after your awareness has already moved past them. You begin to notice things you used to ignore without effort. Conversations feel different. Environments feel different. Even your own reactions start to feel unfamiliar, like you are observing yourself instead of being fully inside your reactions. And this creates a strange distance that is difficult to explain, because nothing outside has changed, yet everything inside is interpreting it through a completely different lens, and what that lens is slowly revealing is something you were never meant to see all at once. As this continues, the mind starts searching for stability by revisiting the past more often. You remember who you used to be, how certain things used to feel, how decisions used to come more easily, and you try to compare that version of yourself with the one you are experiencing now. But instead of finding comfort in that comparison, you begin to feel an increasing sense of disconnection from your former identity, almost like reading about someone you used to know very well but cannot fully relate to anymore. And that gap between past and present self becomes more noticeable each day, leading you toward a question that quietly grows in the background without giving you a clear answer yet. During this phase, external motivation also starts losing its influence in unexpected ways. The things that once pushed you forward begin to feel less powerful. Rewards feel temporary. Pressure feels less effective. Even fear, which once controlled decisions so easily, starts to lose its grip. At first, this feels like a loss of drive, like something important is fading away. But underneath that surface interpretation, something deeper is actually happening. A shift in the source of motivation itself, moving away from external triggers and towards something internal that has not fully formed yet, and what that internal source will eventually become is still hidden from your current understanding. And then there is the emotional distance that begins to appear without warning. People you once connected with easily may start feeling energetically distant, not because anything has changed in them, but because your internal reference point has shifted. Conversations that used to feel engaging now feel surface level. Environments that used to feel comfortable now feel overstimulating or empty, and instead of explaining this shift to others, you find yourself withdrawing quietly, trying to understand what is happening internally, not realizing that this withdrawal is not separation from life, but separation from a previous version of perception, and where that separation is leading is still unfolding in the background. At some point, overthinking intensifies because the mind tries to regain control over something it cannot yet map. It analyzes memories, replays decisions, questions timing, reinterprets meaning, and searches for patterns that might explain the internal discomfort. But the more it searches, the more complex everything appears, because this is not a problem that exists in logic alone. It is a restructuring of perception itself, and perception does not reorganize itself through analysis. It reorganizes through experience, through time, through observation without resistance, although reaching that stage requires passing through a phase where nothing seems fully understandable yet, and what comes after this phase is something the mind is not prepared to predict. Then something subtle begins to change in how silence feels. Moments without distraction become more noticeable. You start to feel the weight of your own presence differently, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that makes you more aware of internal activity that was always there but never observed. Thoughts feel louder before they become quieter. Emotions feel heavier before they become clearer. And in that process, you begin to realize that what you called normal before was actually a filtered experience, shaped by habits and repetition, and now those filters are starting to loosen, but what replaces them is not immediately obvious, leaving you in a space where awareness is increasing faster than interpretation, and that imbalance is what creates the feeling of being lost. There is also a point where certainty itself starts to dissolve, not in a destructive way, but in a way that removes unnecessary rigidity from how you see life. You stop being fully convinced by old assumptions. You stop reacting automatically to familiar triggers. You start noticing gaps in your previous understanding, but those gaps are not immediately filled with answers. Instead, they remain open, creating a space where new understanding can eventually form. But at this stage, it only feels like uncertainty expanding, and what that expansion is preparing you for is still just beyond the edge of recognition. And just when it feels like nothing is settling, a shift begins quietly, not in external life but in internal resistance. You stop fighting the confusion as intensely. You stop trying to force immediate clarity. You stop expecting yourself to return to who you were before. And in that subtle release, something unexpected happens in your perception of time, of thoughts, of internal pressure. And what begins to emerge from that release is not immediate clarity, but a different way of relating to uncertainty itself, one that slowly starts changing the entire direction of your experience, although the full outcome of this shift is still unfolding out of view. Because what is happening underneath all of this is not breakdown, not failure, not confusion without purpose. It is a recalibration of identity and awareness, where the internal structure that once defined stability is being replaced with something less reactive and more conscious. But this replacement does not arrive fully formed. It builds gradually, through moments of discomfort, through phases of questioning, through silence that feels heavier before it feels lighter. And what it eventually leads to is not just understanding, but a completely different way of experiencing life itself, although the final form of that experience is still ahead, waiting to be discovered. There comes a stage where the confusion does not disappear suddenly, but it changes its meaning. It stops feeling like something wrong is happening and starts feeling like something unfamiliar is forming. The same thoughts that once created tension begin to lose their emotional weight. The same uncertainty that once felt overwhelming starts feeling more like space than pressure. And in that shift, you begin to realize that what you called being lost was actually the early phase of becoming more aware than before, even though that realization does not reveal everything it is connected to yet. Because clarity in this process does not arrive as a single moment of understanding. It arrives gradually, through changes in how you respond, how you observe, how you process experience. You begin to notice that decisions feel less forced, reactions feel less automatic, awareness feels more present even in ordinary moments. And although life is still unfolding with unknown elements, your relationship to that unknown begins to change in a way that makes it feel less threatening and more navigable, although the full depth of that shift continues to unfold quietly beneath the surface. And eventually you reach a point where you look back at this phase and realize it was never about losing direction in life. It was about losing the illusion of a fixed version of yourself so that something more flexible, more aware and more aligned could take shape in its place. But even then, what that new version fully becomes is not something you can fully define in advance, because the process that created it is still ongoing, still evolving, still revealing layers that were never visible at the beginning, and what those layers ultimately lead to is something you only understand by continuing forward.